Hello, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name's Kimberly Flowers. I'm the Executive Director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs. We are thrilled to have you here for what is the third annual Freedom of Expression Policy Symposium. I wanted to start today with a really simple quote and to ask you, and I really mean this like shout out, who said this? Free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. Anybody? You can guess. Aristotle, no. But that's great for the next part. Here's the No, another great guess. This is the second part of this quote. And Twitter is the place where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. Guess who said that? Elon Musk yesterday. And his $44 billion in cash buyout of Twitter. Here was a response to that. Mr. Musk, free speech is wonderful, hate speech is unacceptable. Disinformation, sorry, I spelled that wrong. Good thing I'm not in this competition today. Misinformation and hate speech have no place on Twitter. That was from the NAACP, also yesterday. So here's another quote. One of the biggest reasons for the weakening of democracy is the profound change that's taken place in how we communicate and consume information. I won't have you guess, but that was former President Barack Obama at Stanford University last week, where he was pushing for federal regulations of social media platforms. I wanted to start with this today because I think when the student board last year chose freedom of speech, we knew it would be good, but we did not know how big freedom of speech would be this year and how many different areas of policy could relate to freedom of speech. I just want to remind those of you, a lot of you came to Goldfarb events this year, and we do events that aren't always related to our theme, but the ones that we held this year related to our theme included, started off with Nadine Strossen, who's a lawyer, but she's the former president of the ACLU, and she talked to us about hate speech. We also had an event with another lawyer from ACLU, Emerson Sykes, to talk about free speech protections on college campuses. Our faculty advisory committee, including the 3 judges, it really feels like American Idol here at the front. Woo! Or we need the voice, the chair turnaround is what we really need. But they've done faculty conversations or panel discussions related to how free speech connects to scientific inquiry, that's a hard word to say, as well as looking at free speech in terms of a global perspective. Speaking of global, we also had Nathan Law, an activist from Hong Kong, who was in exile in London, came all the way from London to talk to us about how in Hong Kong free speech is prohibited. We had during Jan Plan, activists and Jan Plan Colby teachers, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, talk about free speech in the classroom. A lot of our semifinalists today have public policy ideas related to the classroom or education. A few other events that we had, the role and rise of disinformation, talking with Colby alum Lisa Kaplan. And one of our last larger, biggest events was talking about social media and political polarization and free speech, and we had a panel for that. I'm just curious. we want to keep this kind of fun and casual. So I'm curious which of those might have been your favorite. So I'm going to run through them really quickly. Just the free speech events. Don't worry about the other cool events that we had. If you were here and you really like Nadine Strossen, raise your hand. Got a couple. How about Emerson Sykes and free speech on college campuses? Not that many, okay. How about our faculty conversation related to scientific inquiry? Does free speech give us better science? 1. How about the activists that we had during Jam Plan talking about free speech in the classroom? A couple. How about the faculty conversation related to global perspectives? You're all going to raise your hand on social media is what I'm feeling. Okay. How about when we had Hong Kong Nathan Law here? Hong Kong Nathan Law is not the way to say it, but looking at free speech in Hong Kong. What about the role and rise of disinformation with Lisa Kaplan? Yeah. And how about the panel discussion related to social media and disinformation? Okay. Good, interesting. That's helpful for me. Thank you so much. So our last event of the year is Thursday, which is this Thursday, with Eric Nam, who is a Korean pop star, but he's a Korean American. He's also an entrepreneur. He's a podcast host. He's many things. And he is going to be here having a conversation related to the rising violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So we'll see you here for that. I also want to mention that we are in the throes right now of choosing next year's theme. So the newly elected Goldfarb Student Executive Board will be deciding this week. They pitched a lot of great ideas last night, including the current board members. And I'll be picking probably 2, maybe 3 of those, and they'll be voting on them this week. So if you know people on the board and you're curious, feel free to chat with them. So the last thing I want to go over, let's just kind of do some housekeeping things. 1, timing's going to matter. You have 5 to 7 minutes, semifinalist. I'm going to be timing you. I'm going to be sitting right there. If you go over 7 minutes, I'm going to say time. Okay, I'm not going to hold up cards. Since you don't have to stay here. We have this microphone up here. If you're feeling super confident and you really want to do a TED Talk and you want to do this and you want to point and you want to look right at your audience, go for it. Use this microphone. Use the microphone because we're recording it, okay? So we want to hear you. If you don't want to do that, just make sure you're using this microphone, okay? Since that clock back there is hard to read, these lights are right in your face if you haven't been up here before. Feel free, I didn't bring my phone up here. Feel free to use your phone. I would put it on airplane mode, and I would do the timer so you can time yourself. That's my recommendation to you, and you could bring your phone up here and set that up here. You could also have someone in the audience, a friend, timing you if you want to do that. Couple of things that are new this year. Well, I'll do that after the criteria. Let's go over the judging criteria, especially for those in the audience that maybe don't know this. Our semifinalists today already passed the first stage, and that was a 2-page policy brief. If our faculty judges felt the policy brief had a good argument, then they moved on to this stage. The winners today will be decided based on their presentation, not on the policy brief. This is the judging criteria. 1, provides a specific public policy solution. So we're really looking at details of their policy recommendation. They need to have a familiarity with the current policy landscape, show that they've done their homework, and you must identify a very clear connection to freedom of speech. And your presentation should be polished and practiced. The thing that's different this year is our judges can ask questions of our presenters, just 1 or 2, right after the presentation, and your answers should be brief, no more than 2 minutes. After the judges, after all the presentations, the judges and I will go away. There will be food outside. We will deliberate, come back, and announce the winners. Good luck. Before we move on to our first presenter, I just want to see, well, 1, to the faculty, do you have any other comments or anything about today or anything else that you want to add? Nope, all good. To our presenters, do you have any questions? Are you ready to go? Okay, let's go. You guys know where to find your presentation? You're all set? All right, good luck.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, I'm going to use that microphone. You need to flip it up.
See that? Hello. My name is Chris Ward.
And my name is Amir Giroux.
And this is our policy proposal, Misinfo Ed, addressing social media misinformation through education. We chose the policy directed at social media misinformation because in recent years, social media misinformation has been linked to deepened political divides, worsening pandemic, lack of trust in democratic institutions, and even violence. At its core, social media misinformation is a free speech issue because addressing it often comes with censorship and pushback to censorship. It is important to note that social media information and the events such as the U.S. Capitol storming did not pop out of nowhere. They're a result of thousands of social media posts and misinformation on social media platforms. Companies such as Facebook and Twitter have taken steps to implement misinformation stopping policies such as fact-checking, user removal, content moderation, and affiliation marking. However, it is yet to be seen if these policies are actually effective.
The government has also taken certain measures to combat misinformation. We've all heard of Section 230 of Title 47 of the US Code, which protects social media companies and internet companies overall from litigation if they decide to remove certain things off their platform or if they have certain things on their platform. Another bill, in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and subsequent misinformation campaigns, U.S. Rep. Don Bayer has presented the Educating Against Misinformation and Disinformation bill in the U.S. House, but it has been in committee for the last month. Also, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has signed the first law that requires media literacy lessons in the classroom in Illinois. What our policy proposal is a congressional act that provides grants for educational institutions who create and implement comprehensive misinformation education. What we found is that it's extremely difficult to put education measures through Congress because of the constitutionality question. We looked at measures such as President Johnson's ESEA, Bush's NCLB, Obama's ESSA, and a recent proposal by Senator Booker called the REHYA. And with all of these, since Congress can't dictate what things need to be taught in the classrooms, what the government does is that they can set certain measures and decide that in order to get certain funding, both additional and preliminary funding from the federal government, you must reach these certain measures, and the courts have upheld these laws in Congress. And with our grants, we want certain aspects of misinformation education to be presented. We want this education to teach students how to look at sources and check their credibility, how to look at authors and make sure that they're real, make sure that their bias isn't showing too much, but also look into themselves and think about where they're susceptible to bias. And in addition to that, we want them to become better digital citizens and essentially look at something and realize if it's misinformation or not, and choose not to spread it as a result. And again, the reason we chose Congress, while that presented certain constitutionality questions with the federal government's unparalleled spending ability and wide reach across all 50 states, we felt that we could crush the issue of misinformation in one sweep.
We chose to direct our policy at teens because teens are among the demographic that uses social media the most. 90% of teens report having social media at all, 51% report using it daily, and on average, teens spend up to 9 hours a day on the internet. They're also the most impressionable age group, and there's already education infrastructure in place to make implementation successful. We believe that the impacts of our policy will be immediate and long-lasting. Over time, our policy will only become more effective as subsequent generations of students are educated with misinformation. There's also, our beliefs are backed up in fact. There's evidence to say that school-run programs like sex ed programs reduce teen pregnancy and STD rates. So we know this policy style can work.
The big question is, how does this relate to free speech? Usually when social media companies take measures to fight hate speech or other misinformation, they're met with pushback from activists who say that that's censorship, even if they're private companies. And what we aim to do is, rather than looking at the perpetrators of misinformation, we want to look at the general public and inoculate them and make sure that they're not susceptible and taking that misinformation in. And even with content moderation that these platforms take on, things still slip through the cracks. And what we want is people to, even if they see misinformation every day, to not believe it and as a result not spread it. And we believe that misinformation will spread less with a more informed public. And other factors to consider is education being a fairly hot issue right now, given certain laws in states that aim to stop the spread of teaching about racial history in the US or about LGBTQ rights. So we may find that implementing something like this may be difficult. Another thing is bipartisanship is hard to come by these days, but the last 3 major reforms in US education have all been bipartisan. And the last thing is tech companies having immense lobbying presences. They're some of the most valuable companies in the world, and we hope to curtail that by shifting the blame away from them and their practices, and rather educating the public, and in a way that these tech companies would back us up, because we're not blaming them, essentially. We're better preparing the public to fight issues that tech companies created in the first place. And with that, we'd like to take some questions from the judges.
Yeah, thanks. That's fantastic. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about that piece of the education that would entail looking at an image, teaching people how to look at something, or not an image or a story or something, and discern, you know, its value or its facticity.
I think one thing is looking at the source that's posting that image, if it's coming from an unverified source or if it's coming from simply a person rather than a news outlet. That's one way to discern if it's misinformation or not. And another thing is we want to show them to look for bias. So even if it is coming from a legitimate source, whether to look at if it's an opinion piece or if it's being used to push a certain narrative, we want to educate them on all those aspects.
I guess I'll ask one more quick one. How much do we know about the effectiveness of this kind of curriculum? You mentioned, you know, sex ed and some other kinds of policies that have been implemented in this way, but how much do we know about like something like this, its effectiveness for actually reducing people's, you know, spread of misinformation or whatever?
That's a great question, and I think the case we have to look at is the Illinois law that was passed in August of 2021. So it hasn't even been a full year, so it's hard to tell how well these kinds of measures would play in fighting these issues, which is why we looked at other education-based measures like sexual education, since this is a very novel concept.
Also, the ESSA and the other measures that we looked at with former education federal policy reforms have shown success in the past. So that also, we know that it can work.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Okay. My name is Caitlin, and I'll be presenting on integrating cyber ethics and media literacy into the classroom. Many Americans assume from our constant consumption and production of online content that because our society has grown up with social media, that we've also grown into it. This, of course, means that our favorite media spaces are fantastical places where people only share the most enriching, kind, and true content. But we obviously know that just isn't the case. Our favorite platforms have become playgrounds for bullying, polarization, hate speech, misinformation, and crime. Valid concerns for the safety and well-being of the American public has generated frequent debate over the prospect of federal regulation of the public's online activity. But these efforts have ultimately proven dangerous and futile, as such legislation could risk setting a legal precedent for restricting our constitutional right to the freedom of speech. However, agreeing that the government should not enable the restriction of our freedoms does not mean that we can accept the internet as a lawless land, at the risk of disintegrating incontrovertible truths, American values, and even democracy as we currently know it. Thankfully, the means to instigate a cultural reform of our irresponsible online media practices is within reach, through none other than the dedicated individuals who already deal closely with its consequences every day, our teachers. K-12 teachers have already begun specifically addressing media literacy and cyber ethics topics in the classroom because the effects of unstructured media use are painfully apparent in our young people's real-world social and educational engagement. However, teachers also face significant barriers in implementing programming due to the administration who fail to recognize its importance, which leads to an inability to address the topic for long-term impact. This is exacerbated in low-income and predominantly Black and Hispanic public schools. These issues can be easily circumvented by empowering teachers with a standardized curriculum on mindful cyber practices through the core concepts of media fact-checking, the nature of knowledge, and ethical content sharing. Media literacy teaches concise fact-checking and habits applicable to all media types. The act of fact-checking as you read drastically cuts down on the spread of misinformation and gives a reader more nuanced understanding of the topic and the author's intent and biases, which helps to decrease polarization. In his ML handbook, Michael Caulfield presents a quick fact-checking method called sifting, which just asks students to stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. Caulfield and similar sources elaborate on these steps with skills that expand a student's scrutiny of internet media, creating a habit of healthy skepticism, which is absolutely necessary in navigating modern media because consumers must be aware that author intent is not as altruistic as we would like to assume. Skepticism is crucial for mindfully and intentionally navigating online content and media. Traditionally, we are taught to accept the knowledge we are given because of our unconscious recognition that it comes from trusted sources, like our textbooks and our teachers. But this unquestioning trust does not translate to cyberspace. Every perceivable fact, opinion, or thought can be found online, and the overwhelming majority of them come from sources who are not verified, educated, or benevolent as our teachers are. Schools must equip students with the understanding that real knowledge comes from years of research, collaboration, discourse, and peer-reviewed consensus. By cultivating a culture of evidence, students become committed to personally digging out the truth, which will help them evolve into critical thinkers, normalize moral thinking, and develop discussion practices that guard future voters from the encroachment of polarization and misinformation, which in the end will make them better democratic contributors. Possibly the most difficult issue for schools to solve with standardized education on CE principles is the dissonance between American social values and our online engagement with other users. Social media spaces all too often accommodate bullying, harassment, and hate speech, which would not be acceptable in any other social environment. The CE portion of the curriculum will enable students to identify damaging content in their media feeds to better protect themselves and others. To do so, students will be taught simple methods for curating their feeds to age-appropriate, interesting, and more reliable content. For this, I propose a simple and easy-to-remember approach I call the 3 Rs, which calls for students to recognize, regulate, and remove damaging content by asking a series of questions, like what am I looking at, and how and why does it make me or others feel, and then calls them to remove the harmful posts and seek out positive and diverse content for a healthier online experience. Now, time is a precious commodity in schools because of the limited contact hours. Implementing something new often means pushing something else out of the agenda. Therefore, I would suggest that the core of this curriculum could be taught in skill or study classes, like homeroom, or in supplementary enrichment courses with librarians, where currently students are already taught how to use databases. Furthermore, MLC concepts should be age-appropriate. The MLC topics taught to younger children should grow with the needs and the level of the students just like any other topic. For older students, the curriculum could transition from committed class time to demonstrating proof of concept in assignment rubrics, which could look like a brain map or an index of the steps the student took to fact check. Lastly, equity across schools without access to reliable internet and computers may be an immediate concern to implementation. But I would counter this by suggesting that it is advantageous for students to complete these assignments on their personal phones rather than in computer labs. However, equity can't be addressed with personal devices alone, because although phones are now pervasive across class divides, there will always be those without them. Students in need should be accommodated with printed copies or school-provided devices and buddy with a friend or classmate. There is much work to be done concerning how to interact in the cyber world, and the best thing we can do to protect our future generation is educate them into becoming better internet explorers. Teaching media literacy and cyber ethics is just the first step we must take in protecting our freedom of speech in the new digital age. Democracy itself relies on informed, educated, and ethical population, yet the scourge of disruptive and divisive behavior online, and specifically on social media, has been allowed to attack these core values. As government intervention threatens the very rights we aim to protect, the revitalization of our standardized K-12 curricula to include media literacy and cyber ethics is a critical step in preparing modern Americans to be responsible and informed citizens online and IRL. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is, how do you ensure buy-ins from the teachers and also from the students? You're assuming students would sit there and listen, and as a professor, I can tell you that is not always going to happen for various reasons, especially at a younger age in high school. I mean, do we even remember what we learned in a high school algebra class, for instance, right? Like, so how do you ensure buy-ins on all fronts?
For the buy-ins for the teachers, most of the information that I found in my research was actually by librarians. And so we already have the strong access and support to librarians who have like a vested interest in making sure their students are informed. And I think that librarians and teachers who teach the research and study topics that are so valuable are one of the most underused and unrecognized resources in American education. And I mean, like, more responsibilities for teachers. I'm sure they won't be like stoked like right off the bat, but I think that they're ready and willing. And then for students, to your point of them not remembering the things that they learn in high school, I would pose to start this as a curriculum that is supplementary throughout elementary to high school to like keep up with it, and to make social reform, it has to be something that we always think about. And now the most current generation is getting their first phone before the age of 11, so I would actually like have it start but 3rd grade or even a little bit earlier, to not only make them think about how to use the internet, but how to morally think and have productive conversation, which isn't just applicable to media, but to all types of education.
Real quick,
Yeah.
One of your slides there about how this approach talks about how like removing content that makes you feel bad, basically, which I can see to being very relevant for things like bullying, but less so for things like misinformation, where we think about information bubbles, and maybe there are things that make you feel bad that you don't want to see, but maybe you should be seeing. So I was wondering if there's a little bit of a like that might be applicable to some parts of this and not others.
Yes, definitely the ethical content sharing was meant to specifically address harassment rather than misinformation. I see how like it could get confused with something you don't want to see versus it being like a different opinion or different misinformation. But the goal of the curriculum, I think, is to make students think about what they're looking at instead of having the knee-jerk reaction of, I don't like this, it's true, and yada yada. So I think the distinction is definitely something it needs to look more into. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Serena Kleba, a first year here at the college. I'm also from New Orleans, Louisiana. I say this not to make you think that I'm super fun nor cool. However, if you jump to that conclusion, please be my guest. That will make my job up here a whole lot easier. However, I share my geographic roots with you today to show why this presentation is so close to my heart. If I was to go to one of the 3 remaining abortion clinics in the state of Louisiana, my medical practitioner would be legally obligated to provide me with information about the procedure that is both medically inaccurate and politically motivating. What is happening in Louisiana and across the United States is more than immoral, it is also a violation of international medical standards. The Nuremberg Code for Medicine makes clear that medical procedures performed without clearly and honestly informed consent constitute crimes against humanity. While what is happening in Louisiana and across the United States is nothing akin to the crimes committed before Nuremberg, it is still critical to draw this distinction to understand the gravity of the situation at hand. The harms committed by the current system are made possible by exploiting a gap in First Amendment speech protections for medical practitioners. Today, we will look at how to close this gap in speech protections and subsequently allow for doctors to freely inform consent during the pre-abortion counseling period. According to the National Women's Health Network, 34 United States currently require some form of pre-counseling prior to an abortion. However, according to the Guttmacher Institute, 8 of these states, including my home state of Louisiana, which, along with the 7 other ones, is colored blue on this map, require medical practitioners to disclose factually incorrect information in this pre-abortion counseling period. The required information varies from currently disputed claims, such that personhood begins at conception, to claims that the medical industry has completely debunked, such that having an abortion will ultimately harm your long-term fertility. This medically inaccurate information is designed to discourage women from obtaining what is both a safe and currently legal medical operation. So, considering all of these facts, the logical follow-up question is simply, how do we let this happen? The short answer, well, federalism and America's love for a good lawsuit, but more importantly, that different appellate courts across the country have protected medical speech to a different degree, thus creating a standard that varies from district to district. There is no nationalized standard to what degree of protection is afforded to in-office medical speech. And in fact, the National Law Review noted in 2016 that this inconsistent standard creates openings for states to regulate medical speech, not only in terms of medical malpractice lawsuits, but also to regulate the information that is required to be given in office. The last time the Supreme Court issued a major holding on Roe versus Wade was in the 1992 case of Southeastern Pennsylvania, or Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. The Casey case ultimately established what we currently know as the undue burden standard. Effectively, any regulation on abortion that is not considered an undue burden under Casey is legal within the United States. Pre-abortion counseling, while it may be a burden to access, is not considered an undue burden, thus has been considered legal under our current standards. And so considering that under current standards, pre-abortion counseling is fully legal, yet it also violates medical ethics and fundamental principles of free speech, I present the following proposal. The United States Supreme Court should reiterate that medical practitioners, specifically abortion providers, have a First Amendment right to provide true, research-backed medical advice without political mandate to protect their patients' right to honestly informed consent. Now, obviously, as with anything concerning abortion, this is easier said than done. And the proposed holding, just like any holding issued by the Supreme Court, will undoubtedly have ripple effects across the legal sphere. Thus, we have to turn to consequences that could happen for potentially similar cases. The first area of concern is that the proposed ruling would invalidate the current 20 individual state bans on conversion therapy, a medically disproven practice of treating being LGBTQIA as a mental illness, and thus providing mandatory and often incredibly harmful therapy to treat said illness. This is undoubtedly a legitimate concern. However, if legal precedent is any indicator, this concern is unlikely to materialize. In 2013, a lawsuit challenging California's own ban on conversion therapy was challenged using a First Amendment approach. However, that approach ultimately failed, as the Ninth Circuit ruled that because California's ban was consistent with the well-documented and prevailing opinion of the medical community, it was not a violation of a practitioner's First Amendment rights. Pickup versus Brown, this ruling is actually consistent with my proposal, as it also includes a medical factuality standard. Moreover, similar concerns exist about changes to medical speech being used to invalidate the grounds for medical malpractice lawsuits. However, these concerns are also unfounded, as they all come back to this medical truth, the idea of including a truth standard within my proposal. Now, the looming question for any of changes to abortion policy is effectiveness. And that is why I chose to go through the Supreme Court specifically. Considering how divided Congress is right now, and the fact that existing at the intersection of free speech and reproductive rights, the Supreme Court is uniquely positioned to pass this proposal. In fact, the more conservative justices, such as Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Roberts, have demonstrated that they are incredibly open to free speech arguments, even when it may intrude on their other beliefs, especially surrounding things like abortion. While no lower courts are currently in the process of discussing a test case, considering the quantifiable harms committed by the current policy and the national inconsistencies, there is a high chance that a test case would ultimately come before the Supreme Court, thus offering them an opportunity to issue a holding such as my proposed. And so, now that all of the politics is aside, it's time for us to examine the significant powerful impact of this proposal. In the year 2020, a year when abortion rates were already depressed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, over 20,000 individual people seeking abortions would have had their quality of care dramatically improved by this proposal. Moreover, the proposed expansion has an added benefit of increasing trust in the medical establishment and getting the government out of the operation room. And so while all of this may seem very up in the air, it is clear that I, as a woman in Louisiana, should be able to walk into my doctor's office and get the care I need and I deserve. And this proposal offers me the opportunity to obtain that.
Thank you. So if you go the free speech route rather than the medical malpractice route, I'm curious if that's complicated at all by doctors acting in their capacity as employees of various private organizations, and so therefore without recourse to First Amendment protections. Or maybe not, you might actually know more about this.
I think while that is a legitimate concern, there has been an established national standard that medical speech is protected differently than other forms of private speech because in lots of situations, it quite literally is life or death. Anything else? No? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. And my policy proposal is called Open Science, closing the case on health misinformation and disinformation. Health misinformation is not a new phenomenon. We often encounter misinformation ranging on topic from drugs to vaccines and eating disorder. One of the infamous examples for this is a study published by The Lancet in 1998, which claims that MMR vaccines causally debunked by the scientific community. It has led to lower immunization rate in Northern American and Western Europe in the next 2 decades. The reason why this is such a prevalent issue is because accurate scientific information is drawn by sensationalized news. This study shows that there is a negative association between information quality and engagement level on health information on YouTube. And another reason is that technological platform reward engagement rather than precision and reinforce misinformation through our algorithm. This graph shows that on both Facebook and Twitter, the more users are more inclined to share emotionally charged news coming from less reliable resources because it led to better engagement. The reason why this is such a difficult issue to combat is because information is ever-changing. During the COVID-19 pandemic, to keep up with such fast-changing knowledge, and because of that, many people find it hard to find reliable sources for themselves. The second reason why this is such a challenging issue is because misinformation thrives in the absence of accessible and reliable information, and during a period of great societal division. This is particularly relevant to our time because during the last few years, misinformation has been weaponized to attack vulnerable groups and undermine public health response. There's also a like argument in the scientific community regarding fundamental questions, such as the definition of misinformation and disinformation, the impact of it, and how this impact varies across subpopulation. And most importantly, the biggest challenge for us to address is how to answer the question of balancing between freedom of speech and protection from misinformation and disinformation. Understanding this issue, I would propose a three-part solution. First, we need to expand our understanding of the matter at hand, and we can achieve this by investing in research that provide policy-relevant evidence on the consequences of misinformation and disinformation health outcomes and the effectiveness of different intervention methods. We also need to find common grounds on critical topics such as the definition of misinformation and disinformation and the cyber ethics of protecting user privacy. Second, we need to address the existing prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. We need to implement stricter regulation of fraudulent science to prevent misrepresentation and manipulation of data findings. This would prevent illegitimate health practitioners to abuse their credibility to spread misinformation. We also need to encourage media companies to strengthen the content moderation policy, by measures such as imposing more punishment on accounts that repeatedly spreads misinformation, which is also known as super spreader, or increase the media reach of trusted health practitioners. Finally, it's very important to note that given the prevalence of health misinformation and disinformation, it's really up to each individual to differentiate fact from fiction. And study shows that information literacy and science literacy are associated with less vulnerability to misinformation and a lower propensity to spread it. Therefore, it's the most crucial part about combating misinformation and disinformation is to build resiliency by increasing the information and health literacy among the community. And we can get here by equipping people with the knowledge to identify and avoid spreading health misinformation. This can include knowing how to detect tactics by super spreader or AI-generated fake news, or even just understanding the impacts of algorithm on what we see on the daily. We also need to build a more health-educated community by engaging more citizens in scientific processes and opening up public access to patient pages, which provide fast and digestible health information. Finally, we need to incorporate health and digital and health literacy programs across all education environments to ensure that future generations are more equipped to deal with the infodemic. Before I end my presentation, I would like to return to a question of maintaining freedom of speech while protecting everyone from misinformation and disinformation. And to this, I would answer that freedom of speech is not just the absence of restriction. To make a speech that is truly free, a person must be informed of all sides of the conversation to make a stance that is the most beneficial to themselves, and equipping people with the right knowledge to identify, to protect themselves against misinformation will be the most sustainable way to lead us to a future where it is no longer an issue for the community. Thank you.
So your proposal has, it seems, a number of different kind of strands, and the one at the end is more about science literacy, but you had some earlier ones that were more about restrictions on social media companies, I think. So could you maybe say a little bit more about that one, if that is indeed part of your proposal?
Yeah. For the part about encouraging media companies.
Yeah, that part.
And for this, there has been a lot of companies that has tried the same measures to ensure that misinformations are not are not coming from repeatedly same sources. For example, Facebook, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it has removed 220 million pieces of content, and also removing over 3,000 pages and accounts that repeatedly violate its rules against COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation. Thank you.
Oh. Anyone know what the play button on this thing is? Oh, there it is. Okay. No. Is this one, right? Oh, it did go up. All right, wonderful. Well, hi, I'm Jason Milch. I'm a sophomore here at Colby, and I'm going to be presenting the results of a study I've been doing here for a year at Colby with the psychology department on free speech here at Colby, shortcomings in our culture, and recommendations for improving discourse on our campus. Obviously, free speech has been an issue on the college campuses for a long time. There's been protests about a number of political questions over many decades. Some of these protests have also focused on what the proper limits of free speech policies are, like should offensive speech be prohibited. But in recent times, protests and discourse on campus have shifted to another question, which is to what extent should pre-existing free speech policies and attitudes be enforced? How well are those being enforced on campus? And Colby has a very unique relationship with that question. We had a free speech task force here just about 3 years ago that investigated in depth the question of what should our policy be and what kind of a free speech community do we want to have here. We recently, of course, we had a protest at the homecoming football game that raised the question of what the proper limits of protest should be. We've also had protests of other speakers in recent years that have really brought this issue to the forefront of the Colby community. So my research question is, how does Colby's current free speech climate compare with Colby's institutional vision for free speech? Notably, this is not a normative question. I'm not answering the question of what should or should not the limitations be. I'm asking relative to Colby's own vision for free speech, the one the administration has set, hopefully listening to the voices of the community, how close is the situation on the ground in accord with that vision? To do that, I've spent the past year running a study on this issue. It has two forms of data, qualitative and quantitative. For qualitative data, I did interviews with 6 senior administrators and 2 senior faculty, all of which were anonymous, which I used to construct an image of what Colby's goal is. And then I evaluated how that goal was being how well that was being met through a survey that I sent out for and distributed for about a month and a half, where people were paid $5 to take it. Used a Likert scale, so that's 1 to 7, with 1 being strongly disagreeing to a question and 7 agreeing. We got a lot of responses, 644, although some of those responses are excluded from the data I'll present here for statistical reasons. And then to get into a few of the technical stuff, but it's important, use the univariate ANOVA analysis to determine the differences between Republicans and Democrats, because one of the questions on the survey is, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And so with that analysis, you can determine the differences in attitudes between Republicans and Democrats who took the survey. And to very briefly summarize some of the numbers I'm going to have up there, you have an F value, which essentially shows the data is better as it gets larger, a p-value where the data gets better if the p is smaller, and then you have an eta, that's that little n symbol there, that tells you the degree of differences between Republicans and Democrats. So how, even if Republicans and Democrats feel differently about an issue, to what extent do they feel different? That's what that number tells you. So problem 1 is that a large portion of our community does not understand their free speech rights. 20% of respondents have reported that they did not know that Colby even had a free speech policy, while 33% reported they knew we had a policy, but they didn't know what speech is not protected under the policy. This is a bipartisan problem, since if you look at the numbers in the chart, you see that Republicans and Democrats, the mean is about the same for them. So Republicans and Democrats both are essentially equally uneducated in their rights. And as one student put it on a survey in a comment, I know very little about what free speech what the free speech policy is, and I feel as though I'm not the only one. It could be useful to inform students about what it is and what it means throughout the school. And my recommendation would be that Colby should produce a training program for students who are interested in becoming more acquainted in their free speech rights. I imagine students who might want to put a controversial speaker on campus would really benefit from having a formal program for learning about the rights and the limitations of those rights. And something that inspired me to come up with this policy is during my interviews, I would often try and get the interviewees to kind of summarize what the free speech policy is. Well, can you explain, what is protected under the policy? What kind of speech is prohibited under the policy? And very often I would just get the response, well, you have to read the policy yourself. But for students who maybe just don't have the experience reading, college policies and that kind of legalistic formal language, they're not going to be able to become well educated in their rights. So I think we'd really benefit if we had a formal training program. The second problem is that there are unclear remedies for the violation of rights that are in the policy. We have 45% of respondents reporting that they are not aware of a remedy for the violation of their rights under the policy. And remember, this is in addition to those who don't even know that a policy exists in the first place. There's two problems with people not knowing what their rights are. Number one is there's a very famous Latin legal maxim, ubi jus, ibi remendum, where there is a right, there is a remedy. And so if you're trying to establish a right of some kind, in this case it's a right to speak, if you don't have a clear remedy for the violation of that right, there really is no right in the first place. And so the lack of an effective remedy for the violation of free speech right under the policy really is very effectively undermining the goals of that policy. And number two is there's a practical issue. If people don't know what the remedies for the violation of their free speech rights are, they're not going to be as likely to speak. And then I'll also turn your attention to the table up there. The table there measures a slightly different question. It doesn't measure whether people know what the remedies for their rights are. It measures to what extent people of different political parties feel free to speak on this campus. And we see that Republicans feel about 2 points lower on the mean than Democrats, meaning they feel less comfortable speaking on campus than Democrats do. And so my suspicion is that if you combine the fact that people aren't aware of their rights, and then you combine that with that there's no remedy for the violation of those rights, that's contributing to a partisan divide on campus. And when you have a partisan divide, that creates the risk of inter-party conflict, and we want to avoid that. My recommendation would be to designate BIPR, the BIPR team, as a free speech complaint mediation referral service, because in my interview with someone who was familiar with that, they actually told me that the BIPR team has, by coincidence, chosen to become relatively well-versed in the free speech policy, and that if someone was to make a complaint to them about the violation of a free speech right, they would try and mediate that complaint, and if it couldn't be mediated, they would forward it to the proper administrator for review. And so I think BIPR would be a wonderful device for handling these complaints. The third problem is that a large portion of our community disagrees with Colby free speech policy. 31% of respondents reported that emotional harm is a sufficient ground to prohibit speech. There's nothing wrong with that opinion. However, Colby's policy doesn't agree with that. Colby says that unless speech falls into some very narrow categories, it cannot be prohibited. And Judge Learned had, in a very famous opinion, said that thoughts are not only the keys of persuasion, but the triggers of action. So if you have people thinking differently, and if you look at the table, you can see that Republicans are a little bit more tolerant of offensive speech than Democrats are. That creates, again, a risk of inter-party conflict. And my recommendation to solve that problem would be to have more events dedicated specifically to free speech on campus that would give the community a chance to have a debate with each other about whether or not offensive speech should be protected. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your questions.
I'm just curious if in your survey you have any evidence about the kind of the kinds of dissatisfaction that people, I mean, I get that, like, what you're kind of saying is that people don't understand what the policy is, but in as much as you asked about it, like, how much did people disagree with other parts of the policy?
Well, the main question we had dedicated to the issue of whether people disagreed with the policy was that emotional harm question. Do you think emotional harm should be prohibited? And I mean, that's a pretty important question, because if you have a free speech policy, you're necessarily accepting that there's going to be some speech that makes people feel bad. That's nonetheless going to be protected. But I have the survey open right now. And some other questions I can tell you now is we asked speakers with offensive opinions should not be permitted to speak on campus. I think we also saw that Democrats are a little bit more likely to say that they should be prohibited and Republicans should be permitted. Should Colby's administration prevent more offensive speech? And that was another question. And another question, the final one in that section was, should Colby's administration protect more offensive speech? On all of those questions, we saw a very good amount of people essentially taking the restrict more speech view, which again is fine. People are entitled to that opinion, but that creates a risk of conflict when the administration permits a lot of offensive speech.
I'm very confused by this. Is on this slide specifically that students are disagreeing with the policy, but students don't know the policy. So what are they disagreeing on if they don't know the policy?
Oh, some students certainly are aware of the policy. What I recall is I think the statistic was around 20%, which is about 2 in 10, well, not just students, it was community members in general don't know the policy. The other 80% have some familiarity with policy, and it's of those 80%, 31% think that offensive speech should be prohibited.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, yes, 45 more seconds.
Okay, great. Just quickly on the third recommendation, did you get a sense from the survey or develop a sense otherwise of which particular kinds of free speech events would be more conducive to improving people's sense of what the policy is and improving free speech on campus? So are debates more productive than informational sessions on the policy, that type of question?
Well, a good amount of students in the comment section of the survey, where they were free to write whatever comment they wanted, expressed frustration with the fact that they saw a lot of bias in the kind of speakers that were being invented to campus. They thought that they were generally from one political persuasion rather than a more diverse array of persuasions, although they didn't suggest a specific type of event they wanted. But just taking that frustration with the lack of diversity, my suggestion would be to have more debates on campus. That's something I've noted I think is kind of absent from our speakers. We have a lot of talks. We don't have a lot of debates. And if we had more debates where students and the rest of the community was being actively exposed to new ideas, but having the disagreement between those ideas respectfully expressed, I think that would do a lot of help for the culture here. Thank you.
Right, let's see. All right, hi, my name is Eli Shirbagish. I'm a first year here at Colby, and I will be presenting on freedom of the press in the United States and ways that we can enhance it. All right, so by various standards, or by various measures of living standards, the US lags behind many Western democracies. So this is an argument that we've heard from progressives a lot in recent years in fields like healthcare, education, social welfare, child welfare, you know, the list goes on. And this is also the case for freedom of speech, but this is an issue that's often overlooked because it's more of a values-based issue than it is driven by data. It's kind of hard to quantify like the effects of certain levels of freedom of speech. So a little background. So the international organization Reporters Without Borders has come up with what's known as a press freedom index. So the way it's developed this is with two main sources. So the first is an 87-question survey which it sends out to sociologists, lawyers, media professionals around the globe. And it asks them various questions about media in certain countries with the categories like media transparency, the concentration of media, the role that governments play in restricting media. And it also includes data about like the physical risk that journalists face in various countries, whether that's being detained by law enforcement or being arrested, and in some very severe cases, being killed. So the U.S. ranks 44th in the world out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom. So this is pretty good in the grand scheme of things, but obviously demonstrates that there's a lot of room for improvement. And we've seen an erosion of press freedom in certain regards under both the Obama and the Trump administrations. Although there was some initial improvement under Obama, his administration pursued whistleblowers in a very aggressive and unprecedented manner. And during Trump, we saw a lot of anti-free speech rhetoric, with Trump going so far as to call the press the enemy of the people, which was a major violation of American norms. And another important piece of policy is the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 1967, and it's been amended various times since then. So among other things, this act allows journalists to request certain pieces of information from the government. However, unfortunately, due to the inefficiency of the system, it's often very challenging for journalists to get this information on time, which has a restrictive effect on how educated we are regarding policy, as well as other areas. Next, let's take a look at some policies abroad. So here I have examples from 3 Scandinavian countries, which happen to be the first, second, and third best countries for press freedom in the world, according to Reporters Without Borders. So in Norway, in 2020, they passed a media responsibility law that defines journalists' freedoms and responsibilities. So this is a really clear example of the government taking an approach that really promotes it, rather than sort of a libertarian approach, which kind of allows the media to do its own thing. In Finland, we've seen recently proposed legislation intended to protect media and journalists from online hate speech. And there's also a very high level of public trust in Finland. In the US, levels of support for sort of the value of freedom of speech is actually very high. It's higher than a number of Western and Central European countries, interestingly. But public trust in the media is not as high, and that's something we've seen a lot in recent years due to political polarization, which applies to public trust in media as well. And then also in Sweden, we see that that's the world's first country to adopt a press freedom law back in 1766, well before the idea of freedom of the press was outlined in the U.S. Constitution. So you see it's a really important cultural norm there. So moving on to some U.S. policy recommendations. One of these is a proposal by the American Civil Liberties Union to create a national media shield law. So this is a policy that gives journalists more say over whether or not they disclose their sources to the public or to the legal system. A number of states actually already have these laws in place, but a number of them don't. So that means that there's a lack of congruity nationally, which is why the ACLU proposes that Congress pass a law like this. Also, interestingly, an important reform has to be politicians adopting rhetoric that emphasizes the value of press freedom. So it's really critical that there's a bipartisan consensus of politicians just making clear not only that you don't have politicians calling the press the enemy of the people, but also very clearly valuing press freedom. And then the Committee to Protect Journalists also has some interesting recommendations sort of within the federal bureaucracy, and the State Department specifically. So it suggests that the president create a special presidential envoy for press freedom, which would report to the Secretary of State and would attend trials for journalists and advocate for the release of incarcerated reporters at home and abroad. And this would serve as a sort of precursor to an Office of Press Freedom, which would emphasize this issue as well, both in reports and in the implementation of foreign policy. So in conclusion, the U.S. doesn't fully carry out its constitutional commitment to freedom of the press. And the way that we address this issue is both through rhetoric from politicians, but also through substantive policy at the bureaucratic level, at the congressional level, and at the executive level. And I believe that with certain reforms, the U.S. has the opportunity to serve as an international model for policy and further increase its global hegemony. Thank you. All right, questions?
Yeah, thank you. I'm stuck on the point about getting politicians to be less vitriolic. And curious if you have some further thoughts on a mechanism that might accomplish that in some way. What does that piece of your proposal look like?
Gotcha. Let's see. I feel like that's less a piece of legislation rather than. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely challenging to pass legislation to say that politicians have to be in favor of this, because you could make the argument that doing that is actually a restriction of free speech. So I feel like it's more of a suggestion of a rhetorical change. And I know that may not necessarily be the most satisfying answer, but it's definitely something that would be very challenging to enforce. But it's definitely an important part of reform. Okay.
I guess I'm sort of curious about you spent quite a bit of time talking about Norway, Sweden, Finland, Scandinavian sort of exceptionalism here at the top of the rankings. You made this link with trust that's very high in those countries. So I guess I was wondering a little bit about whether the policy, I mean, this is like a really hard question, so in a way it's not fair, but whether the kind of policies that we see emerge from a set of, sort of cultural circumstances that lead to higher trust, or is it that the trust flows from the policies? Again, just your take. I know that this isn't really a fair question.
I guess my instinct based on that question is that it's sort of a cyclical process. I think, both on this issue as well as many others, government policy and rhetoric has an impact on our culture and our values. So I think, changes in both policy reforms and rhetoric can change our culture. And in recent years, you do see a lot of erosion of public trust coming as a result of, Donald Trump being very critical of the media. I mean, like I mentioned, calling it enemy of the people, but we also see frequent accusations of it being biased against conservatives, as well as other groups. So yeah, I would say that these policy reforms do have the ability to increase public trust, but some of that reform also kind of has to occur at the individual level and within the private sector. Great, thank you so much.
There are a lot more people than I thought were going to be here. Kind of making me nervous. Perfect. One quick note on, I guess, terminology before I start. I'm pretty much going to be using LGBTQ+ and queer interchangeably, not necessarily because they map directly onto each other, but because LGBTQ+ is 6 syllables and queer is 1, and this is a timed presentation. And I was practicing, and I kept tricking myself up trying to say all the different letters. But yeah, I want to make sure I start the time with Kimberly correctly so I don't go over. So my presentation is challenging the erosion to the freedom to discuss queerness and queer issues in public schools. Oh, and I'm just going to wait until the timer is ready. Oh, it's already started? Oh, that's embarrassing. Okay, good. On to the next. Okay, so the first, I'm going to start with recognizing there's a currently growth of people who identify as queer in America. Is now the highest percentage ever, 7.1% in 2022. Younger generations are far more likely to identify as queer, as much as 21% of people born between 97 and 03 identifying as such. And because of that, it is increasingly important that Americans have the freedom to learn and to discuss queer issues and identities, particularly in safe spaces like schools that are meant to be instructive and educational. And currently there is an erosion going on of that freedom to speak, most famously or infamously in Florida's parental rights and education law, dubbed by opponents the Don't Say Gay bill, that prohibits K-12 public school teachers from fostering discussion around queer identities and queer issues in grade school levels, and allows parents to sue for injunctions and damages if they believe the school is in violation of that law. And at least 19 other states have kind of launched their own kind of copycat bills. And at the moment, this is a pretty up-to-date statistic. Only, I believe, 5 states are explicitly prohibitory towards that kind of teaching right now, but imagine that map if you have 19 of those. So then the next question is, why do I care? Why is it important that this thing is happening? Because it could lead to generations of young Americans in public school to believe that being queer is something wrong, something other, and something bad, which is especially noticeable given the fact that around 90% of students in America go to public schools, which could in theory be subject to these kinds of laws. And given that queer people, young people, are already 6 times more likely to experience depression, twice as likely to have suicidal ideations, 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than heterosexual peers, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this could be a matter of life and death. Particularly drawing your attention to the thing in the top right, bullying is particularly, the incidence of bullying is particularly high among queer youth. That is particularly related to schools because a lot of bullying takes place in schools, and a chilling effect on speech relating to queerness in schools can make it very hard to kind of counteract those kinds of negative impacts of bullying. And so how do you fix this? What should we do? The short answer is it's hard to do much, but I'm advocating a multi-pronged approach to kind of cast as wide a net as you can, because as I'm going to get into later on, a lot of the traditional remedies are kind of impractical in this situation. So first of all, a potential judicial remedy. The law, as you may not be surprised, is already facing a number of lawsuits alleging violations of the First and 14th Amendments in various parts. And as has been done in Florida, as these laws get passed, they should be challenged, and we should be kind of helping these lawsuits, whether it be funding groups that are engaged in lawsuits. In Florida, one example is the National Center for Lesbian Rights, filing amicus briefs to strengthen the merits of the lawsuits themselves. The question is this a practical policy recommendation? I would sadly say probably not, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court. That is a picture of, after the 2017 landmark ruling of gay marriage, the lighthouse lit up in rainbow colors. Unfortunately, I don't foresee that coming anytime soon, given the nature of the Supreme Court and the nature of lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. So then, the next avenue to pursue, potentially federal legislation. Supremacy Clause gives federal law the opportunity to kind of supersede, overturn any contradictory state laws. The question is this a practical solution? Also, again, probably not. In 2017, the Equality Act bill was introduced and was reintroduced during the Biden administration, which is basically designed to extend the Civil Rights Act to issues of gender identity and sexuality. And it's currently languishing in the Senate. It passed the House, but obviously you need 60 votes to pass the Senate, 67 for cloture in the case of filibuster, which is unlikely to happen. And you're not going to be able to push the kind of bill through budget reconciliation like they've been able to do kind of sneakily with some of the other recent legislation. So again, federal legislation in theory could help. Practicality, I find it very questionable. There's something to be said for maybe, legislation's out there, you can find issue linkage, you can make compromise. I find it personally very doubtful that people would compromise on this kind of issue. So that's also kind of DOA, as it were. So what does that leave for us? If legislation don't really work, the courts couldn't have major drawbacks to them. Public opinion. There has been a remarkable shift in the way people have perceived queerness and being gay in the last 24 years. You can see that there's basically been an inversion, kind of the people who originally in 1996, 68% of people opposed to gay marriage. Now, I guess that's 2020, so like 2 years old, 67% of people support it, which is honestly, to my mind, like an incredible shift. Obviously, I wasn't alive, in 1996, so I can't speak to what the experience was. But I imagine that it has like transformed remarkably and remarkably quickly. And so it's very important to make these kinds of rhetorical arguments and shift public opinion, especially in light of many of you may have seen, there was, I think, a Michigan state lawmaker who went all viral for her statement when an opposing lawmaker basically accused her of being a groomer and sexualizing children, which a lot of opposition to this, a lot of people who are opposed to these kinds of bills find that they're the target of that kind of language, so it's very important to push back on that. Next question is, how do we do that? Because it sounds great in theory, but what does that mean? One option is social media. You may have seen percolating along like Instagram, these kinds of posts that kind of point out the rhetorical failings of Republican arguments about sexuality and sexualizing, and the existence of sexuality as a concept is obviously apparent to young children, like mother, father, married, that's sexuality. It's not sexualizing the children, but like these kinds of arguments that are like, I've seen a lot of on social media, but the question is, are they effective? I would argue that, honestly, probably not as effective as we want because of the nature of collaborative filtering and social media platforms. You really see the content that you expect to see, that you are in line with, that you agree with. So it's probably not going to reach and change the opinions of people that you really need to be changing. And so then, oh no, so that doesn't work either. What are we going to do? Maybe local organizing and grassroots organizing that can be generating knowledge, addressing misperceptions, motivating people to donate money to vote in elections, to disrupt the narratives that being queer is dangerous, is bad, is undermining family values across the nation, et cetera, et cetera. And it could be something as simple as media representation in film and movies and books, or as kind of explicit as these Say Gay billboards that have been cropping up in Florida and across the nation. I have 1 minute left, yes. To kind of counteract these narratives and bring awareness to these issues. But also that is also not practical. What does organizing mean? You could do things like mutual aid style campaigns in organizations, secure small dollar donations on large scales. At the top right is an example of a old Colby Mutual Aid bingo that we published in the Colby Echo Yay newspaper a couple years ago. And practically, again, this really, what does it mean to engage in these kinds of organizations? And I would say that's something that is pretty practical, noting that 76% of students come from the top 20% income. 20% of students at Colby come from the top 1% of income, and there's this kind of incredible intersection of a left-leaning, generally, student population with people with lots of disposable income, and a practical policy solution really has no meaning in the sense that we make something practical. Something is not inherently practical or impractical. The practicality of this kinds of funding and organizing and giving money to organizations that can raise awareness is something that we determine. So the solution is only as practical as we make it. Here is a national level organization working the issue. That is a local Florida member of the lawsuit against the Don't Say Gay bill. If we want to make it practical, donate now. Yeah, that's all I got. Sorry, I was talking kind of fast, but. I hope that wasn't too fast for people. I didn't realize that the time started, and then I was like, oh, gotta catch up.
So my understanding is that you don't believe in any federal changes and that the policy is to improve individual level and donation that hopefully will potentially in the future change.
So basically what I was thinking is that these judicial remedies are kind of foreclosed already in the current political climate. And so what do we have left? We have left to change the opinions of people on the ground because at least in my mind, state legislators are a lot more responsive to on-the-ground public opinion than my 6-term senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, who probably is not gonna be convinced either way. So the idea is to kind of generate that awareness and undercut these narratives that it's dangerous to talk about these ideas, that being queer is bad, so that it can, so that it can kind of create a curve similar to this, where 20 years, it seems like a long time, in the grand scale of life, and America as a country, this is a pretty big change that happened pretty rapidly. I think the idea would be giving organizations the power through donations, through advocacy, through organizing to create this kind of shift around education and talking about queerness in the classroom is basically the idea. If we can't do it federally, if we can't do it judicially, how can we do it? Probably the same way as this. And as public opinion went up, suddenly you have 2017, gay marriage is legal. There's probably a connection there, right?
There is a connection. Actually, we're reading a paper in my class on it. But if you look after 2016, the gap is becoming ever larger because of Obergefell and Hodges, right? Because the public does rely on the federal to inform them of what is the norm and what is the attitude that they should have. Not necessarily everyone is able to form their own, but rather we also gain our attitudes and norms from the federal level as well.
Yes, and I would argue that that's a kind of cyclical relationship that right now, because the federal and the judicial options they seem, at least in my mind, pretty foreclosed, that to push that cycle along so we get that kind of landmark ruling, so we get that federal legislation, so we pass the Equality Act, or something that happens on the federal level that can even further I'm sorry, I wasn't speaking in the microphone. That can even further entrench these norms that you could talk about being queer in the classroom. It's important for the health and safety of the future American generations. To get to that point, you need to start locally, at least in this moment. That seems to me the most practical policy recommendation. Even starting at a place like Colby. We have power. A lot of people have disposable income. Let's do something about it. Thank you.
Does this work? Can I use this? All right, let's do it. Almost done, guys. All right, hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about what I see as a turning point in the conversation about social media and free speech in an FDA for tech. I do want to start by saying this is a dynamic problem, right? Elon Musk just bought Twitter and subsequently took it private, and it's really reinvigorated the discussion about content moderation and free speech. So it's a dynamic problem, but this is a dynamic solution. First and foremost, is misinformation a free speech issue? Yes, misinformation is a free speech issue because we need a common set of facts. In order for me to agree with you or disagree with you, we need to have a common set of facts with which we both agree. Martin Barron was a former Washington Post editor. He said, if you have a society where people can't agree on basic facts, how do you have a functioning democracy? Another expert in free speech is Supreme Court Justice who has since passed long ago. The ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, all right? We're trying to exchange ideas. We're trying to exchange opinions. We're not trying to exchange falsehoods. So, that being said, it is time to reevaluate misaligned incentives for companies like Facebook. Right now, they have one goal, and that is to optimize engagement. They do so by allowing fake news and misinformation, conspiracy theories to proliferate. There's a very specific reason for this. Fake news and misinformation spreads quicker than true facts. And that is because when someone presents misinformation or some type of conspiracy theory, and it's met with rebuttals or vitriol, and they stand their ground, it shows loyalty to the viewpoint, to the identity, and an affinity, right? So it's almost an expression of an identity, but at the end of the day, it's a falsehood, right? So these common set of facts, so to speak, have gotten lost in the whirlwind. They've gotten lost in the echo chamber. They've gotten lost in the algorithmic amplification. And Facebook is capitalizing on the fact that fake news and misinformation spreads much quicker than that which is proven to be true. Right? This misaligned incentive, right, to optimize engagement is helping. It's driving their profit, it's driving their revenue, it's driving their ad revenue, right? So it's time for this misaligned incentive to change. And no one said it best than Roger himself. Roger was an initial investor in Facebook. He actually came to speak here. Former venture capitalist turned activist. He said, Facebook will not fix itself. All incentives direct the company to stay on its current course. So, that being said, it is time, long overdue, for an FDA for tech. Just as the actual Food and Drug Administration was born out of a need to regulate the hazardous meatpacking industry, the FDA for tech will be a concrete regulatory body that will provide external oversight of Facebook and other such companies and their algorithms. They will do so by setting quantitative metrics as conditions for market access. Another example, the EPA, they regulate arsenic levels in water by mandating that arsenic levels be 10 parts per billion or lower. If they fail to meet these standards, there will be punitive measures. The FDA for tech will follow a very similar format, right? There will be progressively harsher punishments for non-compliance. And this addresses another problem with Facebook, that they wield extreme monopoly power. If they are unwilling to comply with these quantitative metrics, they will lose their market access, and other smaller agents who are willing to comply with these standards will be able to enter the market, making it a more competitive market, which is always better for consumers. And the question of the hour, how can we actually quantify misinformation? Answer, domain-specific counter AI. This will come to life by training a counter AI for each category of possible misinformation, right? There are political misinformation, entertainment misinformation, sports information, all based on different databases. The model will be trained to recognize and assign certain credibility levels, 1, 2, 3, or 4, that will be marketed to users on platforms like Facebook based on, one, the virulence. So how dangerous is it if it's allowed to proliferate and spread? And also something that is still in the works, it is very cutting edge, still some of the research is not even out on this yet. It's being in the works as we talk, but natural language inference, in which you have the model has a claim in front of it. It goes through tons and tons of statements of fact and evidence, and then based on how much there is to corroborate it or refute it, it ascertains whether it is true or false. Obviously, every claim is not true or false. The world is not black and white, and that's why we have levels 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4. If something is level 1, it's probably been proven true over decades. There's really no way to refute it. If something is level 4, it is likely dangerous if allowed to spread, and there is very little or no proof at all to back it up. At this point, Facebook will be required to not take down content, but it will be required to refrain from amplifying this type of content. Level 4 content will not be amplified. It will be posted, and that will be the end of line for it. It will not go out into the echo chamber, so to speak. And content levels 2 and 3, this still puts a lot of agency on the users. If you see something that is content level 3, or credibility level 3 rather, you have the choice to consult a differing opinion. Take it as it is. It's really, the onus is on you to decide for content level 2 and 3, but you have a certain assurance that it has been vetted and objectively assessed with this algorithm. So some key takeaways for this. We cannot have robust debate without a shared set of facts. Diversity of opinion is crucial to democracy. It is crucial to democracy. The point of this is not to have one set of opinions, it's to have multiple set of opinions based on a common set of facts, so we can have civil discourse. Second of all, the FDA for Tech provides external oversight in a clear regulatory body. Right now, the only clear regulation that Facebook is amenable to is Section 230, and in a way that doesn't really do anything for them. It protects them because any content that users post, they're not responsible for. But the FDA for Tech is not going after the content that users are posting. It's going after what Facebook chooses to amplify, and that doesn't fall under Section 230. This would be nothing if there's nothing to actually report. So that's where the counter AI comes in. It will gather these metrics that will be reported to the FDA for Tech, which will also be able to provide guidance, right? Once we have a regulatory body, they can provide guidance for companies like Facebook, and they can also spur innovation. Lastly, is this censorship? This is one of the most salient points, especially with the Twitter drama. Is this censorship? And to answer this question, I will touch upon some of the stuff, the canonical work of Renee DiResta. Freedom of speech is not the freedom of reach. You have the right to post what you want, but you don't have the right for it to be amplified. You don't have the right for it to be in those recommendation algorithms. You don't have the right for it to reach every single corner of the earth. Freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And this was a very collaborative process. I talked to all of these people either over email or in person or over Zoom to get their opinions on the feasibility and efficacy of this proposal. I will take questions now. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how the counter AI works? Because there was just a bit of that passed over me. So I'm curious in particular about, because it seems like what that's going to do is just sort of like read in a bunch of evidence and sort of try to determine if there's some level of consensus surrounding a piece of information. Mm-hmm. Is that right? And then I guess my follow-up question there is, could that be wrong?
Could the algorithm be wrong?
Right. And what would you do in those cases?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say the algorithm could be wrong per se, because it's not really labeling it as true or false, right? It's more of a progressive thing, right? If you have a claim in front of you, you have all these lists of facts, right? This is not being done by a human. It's crazy to think about, but it's not being done by a human. There's tons of facts. It's based on how much there is to refute it and how much there is to corroborate it, you can kind of give a nuanced thing, and that's kind of where the leveling comes in, because I personally don't think anything can just be true or false, especially when we're talking about claims and talking about platforms like Facebook, where people aren't really sharing facts. They're really sharing opinions, right? And as I said before, that is integral to democracy. But this will really assess how much fact is behind it. And even if there isn't a good amount of fact, so to speak, or a lot to refute it, it'll still likely be qualified as credibility level 3, in which case the user can consult a credibility level 1 article, credibility level 2 article, opposing viewpoint level 3 article. It's really only the 4 where the metrics and the quantitative metrics come in, because 4 is stuff that is dangerous, might incite violence, and it really has no logic or sound reasoning, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
But the natural language processing still requires it to be trained on an existing data set that is determined by humans or something else, right? So my question is therefore, when the original, whoever's training it, be biased in the first place? And how do we know that the original trainers or what they're training on is correct or not? Because what we're seeing with the algorithmic biases is that there were biases, like facial recognition, for instance, right? That original is trained differently and therefore wrong. How would you determine that first set of training?
So Professor Eric Lerner-Miller that I talked to, he's actually working on he wants a similar entity for regulating facial recognition tech. He thinks it shouldn't go to market until it passes those certain tests. And to answer your question about a certain set of facts, this would be stuff that is commonly, generally agreed upon. It's really just the definition of facts. There's not going to be anything like nuanced in there, no opinions. It's really going to be facts that over decades, right, or commonly held scientific beliefs. And this is also, this is evolving as we speak. Professor James Allen is working on this right now. They're actually working on publishing a paper. I was talking the other day about it. He sent me an article about NLI at Stanford. It's still being brought to light, but the main takeaway is that establishing an FDA for tech will really usher in the systems required to meet these metrics, right? Once there's an FDA for tech and they're saying you have to meet these standards, I think innovation will really spur out of that. I think there'll be collaboration between users and actual companies, and that's how a lot of these counter AIs will come to fruition to meet the needs of an FDA for tech.
Thank you, Anna. So I know that we're already just at 6 o'clock, so we'll try to deliberate quickly. I'm going to ask that the judges go ahead and step out and head to Sherry's office and grab food if you want it. That's why you're going out first. So give them a few minutes to grab food. We will deliberate as quickly as we can. We will come back in here and announce the first, second, and third place winners. Take pictures, you get a certificate, and you get a whole lot of money. So in just a few minutes, after I walk out, feel free to come out, grab food, relax, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to all 8 of the presenting individuals and teams. We really had a very hard choice to make because we had so much fun watching all of these presentations, the breadth, the depth, the kind of attention given to the presentations themselves. We really, really had a hard choice to make. But it's the moment of truth, and I'm going to reveal our choices here. And I'm going to do each of these in turn. We're going to start with the third place, and I would ask you to come up when I call your name. We have a certificate for you, and as you know, also some money attached to each of these awards. So I'm going to start with third place. Third place is Anna de Rosario for her presentation, A Turning Point, Time for an FDA for Tech. Don't have these in order. Here we go. and I think we have it here. Should we do this over here? Should we get in the light? Let's go over in the light. Yeah, okay, so I will hand this to you, and there you go. And shake your hand.
Maybe show the certificate. There we go. All right. Yay.
Anna, just a bit about Anna's presentation. We were so impressed by this clever policy solution, such a timely topic. It's clear that she's really passionate about this topic, has done a bunch of outside research, and we really expect wonderful things from her going forward with all of these ideas that were in this presentation as well. So thanks again, Anna. Second place, make sure I get the title and name right, goes to Amir Jiru and Chris Ward for their presentation, Misinfo Ed, Addressing Social Media Misinformation Through Education. Chris and Amir, we were really impressed in your presentation with the kind of clever solution of choosing not just to go against tech companies. We were very convinced by that part of your presentation, but instead to educate the audience of the media that come from these major companies. And so we were impressed with the feasibility, with the presentation itself, with all the attention to the current policy landscape. So really well done, second place. Congratulations. Come on up and get your picture. Okay, we're gonna go over the light first. So this is for.
Open your certificates.
Yes, press and Amir and open and show.
Open, please. Thank you.
First place goes to Serena Kleba for her presentation, Freely Informing Consent, a Plan to Change Mandated Pre-Abortion Counseling. Serena, we were from the very beginning taken with your phrase, the intersection of free speech and reproductive policy brings together two really timely issues in a clever, really interesting way. Very polished presentation. We were just impressed all around. So congratulations to you, and come up and get your award. Thanks again to all of you for coming out, for staying for the whole thing, for waiting for us judges, and we look forward to hearing more about all of these ideas in the years to come from all of you. Thank you.